There was once a king whose wisdom amazed the entire world. Kings traveled across deserts to hear him speak. Queens crossed vast kingdoms just to ask him questions. Merchants, rulers, and scholars all agreed on one thing. No man had ever possessed wisdom like his. His name was Solomon. He ruled the kingdom of Israel during its most glorious age. Under his leadership, the nation became rich, powerful, and respected among all the kingdoms of the ancient world. Gold filled the royal treasury. Trade routes stretched across distant lands. The capital city of Jerusalem shined with new buildings, bustling markets, and the most magnificent temple ever built for God. The world saw Solomon as a symbol of divine blessing. But Solomon was more than just a powerful king. According to the ancient scriptures, he was a man personally chosen by God to rule his people. And when Solomon first became king, God gave him a gift no ruler had ever received before. Not armies, not riches, not victory in war. Solomon asked God for something different. He asked for wisdom, and God granted it. From that moment on, Solomon became known as the wisest man who had ever lived. Stories about his judgment spread everywhere. People spoke about the day two women came before the king, both claiming to be the mother of the same child. No witness could prove who was telling the truth. But Solomon saw what others could not. With a single decision, he revealed the real mother, leaving the entire kingdom in awe of his wisdom. Soon his reputation spread far beyond Israel. Leaders from distant lands traveled great distances just to hear the king speak. Among them was the famous Queen of Sheba, who came with difficult questions to test his wisdom. But when she heard Solomon's answers and saw the greatness of his kingdom, she was overwhelmed. "The half was never told to me," she declared. Solomon had become more than a king. He had become a legend. Yet the story of Solomon is not only a story of wisdom and glory. It is also a story of warning. Because the same king who once asked God for wisdom eventually made choices that would lead him far away from the God who gave him everything. How could the wisest man on earth make such terrible decisions? How could the king who built God's temple eventually allow the worship of false gods in his own kingdom? And how could a man who had once walked so closely with God slowly drift away from him? To understand the fall of Solomon, we must begin at the beginning. Before the Golden Palace. Before the temple in Jerusalem. Before the fame that spread across the ancient world. We must go back to the moment when a young and inexperienced prince suddenly found himself sitting on one of the most dangerous thrones in the world. The throne of Israel. Solomon had inherited the kingdom from his father, the legendary King David. David had been a warrior king, a man who defeated giants, conquered enemies, and united the tribes of Israel into a powerful nation. His victories had brought stability and security to the land. But David's life had also been filled with conflict, betrayal, and war. Now the future of the kingdom rested on the shoulders of his son. And Solomon was not a warrior. He was young, inexperienced, and perhaps even afraid. Imagine the weight of that moment. A young king sitting on a throne surrounded by powerful advisors, generals, and leaders who had served his father for decades. Enemies were still watching from the borders of the kingdom. Political rivals waited for any sign of weakness. One wrong decision could destroy everything. Solomon understood this. He knew he was not strong enough to rule by his own ability. So one night, he did something remarkable. Instead of asking God for power, instead of asking for long life, instead of asking for victory over his enemies, Solomon prayed for wisdom. He asked for a heart that could understand what was right and wrong, a mind that could lead people with justice, and a spirit that could rule with humility. God was pleased with Solomon's request. Because Solomon had not asked for riches or power, he had asked for wisdom. So God gave him wisdom beyond measure. But God gave him something else as well. Riches, honor, and influence greater than any king before him. For a time, Solomon ruled with wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. His kingdom flourished. Peace spread across the land. Israel experienced a golden age unlike anything in its history. But power has a way of changing people, and success can slowly transform even the wisest hearts. Little by little, Solomon began making decisions that seemed small at first. A political marriage here, a foreign alliance there, a compromise that didn't seem so dangerous in the moment. But those small compromises would eventually lead the wisest king in history down a path he never intended to walk. a path that would divide his kingdom, break the nation of Israel, and turn his story into one of the greatest tragedies in the Bible. This is the story of Solomon, the king who asked God for wisdom, the ruler who built the greatest temple in Israel's history, and the man who slowly lost his way. Because sometimes the greatest danger is not ignorance. Sometimes the greatest danger is believing that wisdom alone will keep you from falling. And Solomon's story proves something powerful. Even the wisest man in the world can lose his way if he slowly stops listening to God. Long before his wisdom amazed the world, Solomon was simply a young prince living in the shadow of one of the greatest kings in history. His father, David, was already a legend. The people of Israel remembered how David had once been nothing more than a shepherd boy. They told stories of how he faced the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone. They sang songs about his victories in battle and the way he united the tribes of Israel into one powerful nation. David was not only a warrior, he was also a leader who loved God deeply. Many believed he had been chosen by God to guide Israel through its most difficult years. But as time passed, David grew old. Years of war had taken their toll. His once powerful body became weak, and the kingdom he had built now stood on the edge of a dangerous transition. Because whenever a powerful king dies, uncertainty follows. Rivals begin to rise. Ambitious men start making plans. And even loyal leaders begin to wonder who will rule next. In the royal palace, whispers spread quietly through the halls. Who would become the next king of Israel? Some believed it should be David's older sons. Others believed the throne should pass to a stronger warrior, someone capable of defending the kingdom against its enemies. But the decision would ultimately rest with David. And David chose Solomon. For many people, this choice came as a surprise. Solomon was not known as a warrior. He had not led armies into battle. He had not built his reputation on strength or military power like his father. Instead, Solomon was known for something very different. He was thoughtful, quiet, observant. He listened more than he spoke. And those who knew him closely believed he possessed a deep sense of understanding, even at a young age. But wisdom alone does not make ruling a kingdom easy. When David's final days arrived, he called Solomon to his side and gave him a final message. It was not a message about conquering enemies or expanding the borders of Israel. Instead, David spoke about something far more important: faithfulness. He reminded Solomon that the strength of Israel had never come from its armies alone. The true strength of the nation came from its relationship with God. If you walk in his ways, David told his son, your kingdom will stand. Those words would become one of the most important warnings in Solomon's life. Because the throne he was about to inherit was not just powerful, it was dangerous. Soon after David passed away, Solomon was officially crowned king. The moment was both glorious and terrifying. Imagine standing before the entire nation of Israel as the new ruler. Thousands of people looked to Solomon for leadership. Soldiers waited for commands. Advisors expected decisions. Every action he took would shape the future of the kingdom. And the truth was simple. Solomon felt unprepared. Unlike his father, he had never lived the life of a warrior. He had never commanded armies in battle or faced the chaos of war. Yet now he was expected to lead a powerful nation surrounded by rival kingdoms and political threats. The weight of that responsibility must have felt overwhelming. During those early days of his reign, Solomon worked to secure the stability of the kingdom. Some rivals who had hoped to claim the throne were removed from power. Political alliances were strengthened. Slowly, the kingdom began to settle under his leadership. But Solomon understood something important. Even with loyal advisors and experienced generals around him, ruling Israel required something more than strategy. It required wisdom. And Solomon knew he did not have enough of it. So one night, early in his reign, Solomon traveled to a place of worship where sacrifices were offered to God. It was there, in the quiet of the night, that something extraordinary happened. According to the scriptures, God appeared to Solomon in a dream. And in that dream, God asked him a remarkable question. What shall I give you? Imagine being asked that question by God himself. Solomon could have asked for anything. He could have asked for power to defeat every enemy. He could have asked for riches greater than any king before him. He could have asked for a long life filled with peace and comfort. But Solomon's answer revealed the heart of a young king who understood the enormous responsibility placed upon him. Instead of asking for power, Solomon said, "I am only a child, and I do not know how to lead this great people. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to know the difference between right and wrong." It was a humble request, and it pleased God greatly, because Solomon had not asked for wealth. He had not asked for victory over his enemies. He had asked for wisdom. So God answered him. "You have asked for wisdom to govern my people," God said. "Therefore I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before, nor will there ever be again." But God did something even more remarkable. He promised Solomon blessings beyond what he had asked: riches, honor, and influence among the nations. If Solomon remained faithful, his kingdom would flourish like no other. When Solomon awoke from the dream, everything had changed. The young king who once feared the throne now possessed a gift that would shape the future of Israel: a mind capable of extraordinary understanding, a heart capable of judging complex matters, and wisdom that would soon astonish the entire world. Yet the dream also contained a quiet condition. God's promise depended on Solomon's faithfulness. If he walked in the ways of God, his kingdom would prosper. But if he turned away, the blessings could disappear. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon seemed determined to honor that promise. He returned to Jerusalem with renewed confidence. He worshipped God openly and offered sacrifices in gratitude. Soon after, an event would take place that would reveal just how extraordinary Solomon's wisdom had become. An event that would spread his reputation across the world. Two women would stand before the king, both claiming to be the mother of the same child. And the young king would make a decision so brilliant that the entire nation would stand in awe. It would be the moment when Israel realized that their new ruler truly possessed wisdom unlike any other. But the story of Solomon was only beginning, and the wisdom that lifted him to greatness would one day face the greatest test of all. Because wisdom can guide a king to greatness, but it cannot protect him from the dangers of power. And Solomon was about to enter the most glorious chapter of his reign. The Golden Age of Israel. Not long after Solomon became king, the people of Israel began to notice something extraordinary about their young ruler. He did not lead with the loud authority of a warrior. He did not rely on fear to command obedience. Instead, Solomon listened. He observed carefully, and when he spoke, his words carried a depth of understanding that surprised even the most experienced leaders in the kingdom. At first, only those closest to the palace noticed the difference. Advisors and judges who worked near the king began to realize that Solomon had a remarkable ability to see through complicated problems. Disputes that once required long arguments could now be resolved in moments. Questions that had no clear answers suddenly became simple under Solomon's judgment. But it was one particular case that would change everything. One morning, two women were brought before the king. They stood in the royal court holding the same baby, both claiming the child belonged to them. Their voices were filled with desperation, each insisting she was the true mother. The story they told was tragic. Both women had recently given birth while living in the same house. But during the night, one of the babies had died. The surviving child was now claimed by both mothers. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove who was telling the truth. The royal court fell silent as the women argued. Normally, such a dispute might have taken days to resolve. Judges would question neighbors, examine details, and still struggle to find certainty. But Solomon watched quietly. He listened to every word. He studied their expressions, their emotions, their desperation. And then the king made a decision that shocked everyone in the room. "Bring me a sword," Solomon said. The soldiers hesitated but obeyed. A sword was placed in the king's hand. Then Solomon spoke again. "Divide the living child in two," he ordered. "Give half to one woman and half to the other." The courtroom gasped. The women froze. For a moment, the room was filled with silence so heavy that no one dared to speak. Then suddenly one of the women cried out. "No," she shouted. Her voice broke with emotion as she stepped forward. "Give the baby to her. Just don't harm the child." The other woman remained silent. She simply nodded and said the child should be divided. In that moment, Solomon lowered the sword. He had seen everything he needed to see. "Give the child to the woman who begged for his life," the king declared. "She is the true mother." The courtroom erupted in amazement. The decision was so simple, yet so brilliant. Solomon had uncovered the truth not through evidence or witnesses, but by understanding the deepest instincts of a mother's heart. News of the judgment spread quickly throughout the land of Israel. People began repeating the story everywhere, in markets, in homes, and in the streets of Jerusalem. Soon everyone was saying the same thing. The king possessed wisdom from God. But this moment was only the beginning. As Solomon continued to rule, his wisdom appeared in countless decisions. He organized the kingdom with careful planning, appointing leaders and governors to oversee different regions. Trade flourished under his leadership. Caravans traveled across deserts carrying goods from distant lands. Merchants arrived from neighboring nations eager to exchange wealth and resources. Slowly, Israel transformed into one of the most prosperous kingdoms in the region. Solomon also became known as a man of learning. He wrote thousands of proverbs and wise sayings. He studied nature, animals, plants, and the mysteries of life. Scholars and thinkers gathered around his court to listen to his teachings. His reputation began to spread far beyond Israel's borders. Travelers carried stories of the wise king to distant kingdoms. They spoke about his judgments, his understanding, and the incredible prosperity of his nation. Eventually, the stories reached the ears of one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world, the famous Queen of Sheba. She had heard rumors that Solomon's wisdom came directly from God. But rumors were not enough to convince her. She decided to test the king herself. The queen organized a long journey to Jerusalem, bringing with her a caravan filled with treasures, gold, spices, rare gems, and valuable gifts. Her arrival caused great excitement in the city. Visitors from foreign lands were common in Solomon's court, but the arrival of a queen with such wealth and influence was a rare event. When she finally met Solomon, the queen began asking him difficult questions. These were not simple riddles. They were deep questions about life, leadership, justice, and the mysteries of the world. And Solomon answered every one of them. Nothing seemed to confuse him. Nothing caught him unprepared. The queen listened carefully, amazed by his understanding. But Solomon's wisdom was not the only thing that impressed her. She saw the organization of his court, the beauty of his palace, the discipline of his servants, and the wealth flowing through the kingdom. Everything reflected wisdom and careful leadership. Finally, the queen spoke. "The reports I heard in my own land about your wisdom and achievements were true," she said. "But I did not believe them until I came and saw it with my own eyes." Then she added something even more remarkable. "Not even half was told to me." Her words captured the truth. Solomon's greatness had become greater than the stories about him. Before leaving Jerusalem, the queen presented Solomon with magnificent gifts, including enormous amounts of gold and rare spices. And Solomon, in return, honored her with generous gifts and hospitality. The meeting between the two rulers became one of the most famous moments in the history of Solomon's reign. It symbolized something powerful. Israel had become a kingdom respected by the entire world. And at the center of that kingdom stood a king whose wisdom seemed limitless. Year after year, Solomon's wealth and influence continued to grow. Gold flowed into the royal treasury. Trade routes expanded. Diplomats and merchants filled the streets of Jerusalem. The nation experienced a level of prosperity it had never seen before. To many people, it appeared that Solomon's success had no limits. He had wisdom. He had wealth. He had power. But history has shown something dangerous about success. The very things that lift a leader to greatness can also become the seeds of his downfall. Because when a person becomes powerful enough, he may begin to believe that his wisdom alone will always guide him. And that is when the first cracks begin to appear. For Solomon, those cracks would not appear suddenly. They would begin quietly, with small decisions, small compromises, choices that seemed harmless at first. But those choices would eventually lead the wisest king in history down a path he never expected to walk. A path that would slowly pull his heart away from the God who gave him everything. And the golden age of Israel was only just beginning. By the time the fame of Solomon had spread across distant kingdoms, Israel had entered a period unlike anything it had experienced before. It was a time of peace. For generations, the nation had been surrounded by conflict. Under the rule of Solomon's father, David, Israel had fought many wars to establish its borders and defend itself from powerful enemies. But Solomon inherited something different. Because of David's victories, the kingdom was now secure. Enemies who once threatened Israel had been pushed back. Trade routes were open. Neighboring nations recognized Israel as a serious power in the region. For the first time in many years, the people of Israel lived without constant fear of war. This peace allowed Solomon to focus on something no king before him had the opportunity to pursue on such a scale: building. The young king envisioned transforming Jerusalem into the heart of a magnificent kingdom, a city that would reflect both the prosperity of Israel and the glory of God. And at the center of that vision stood a project greater than anything Israel had ever attempted. Solomon would build a temple. Not just any temple, a sacred house dedicated to the worship of God, greater and more beautiful than anything the world had seen. This temple had once been the dream of David. The great warrior king had wanted to build it himself. But according to the scriptures, God told David that the task would belong to his son. David had been a man of war. Solomon would be the king of peace who built the house of God. So preparations began. The project required enormous resources. Stonecutters carved massive blocks of stone from the mountains. Skilled craftsmen were brought from neighboring lands. Caravans transported cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. Year after year, thousands of workers labored to shape the materials needed for the sacred structure. The project became one of the largest building efforts in the ancient world. Solomon worked closely with the king of Tyre, a powerful trading partner whose craftsmen were famous for their skill. Together, they organized the construction with incredible precision. Every stone, every piece of wood, and every decorative element was carefully designed. When construction finally began in Jerusalem, the city became a place of constant activity. Workers lifted enormous stones into place. Carpenters shaped beams of cedar wood. Artists crafted decorations of gold, bronze, and precious metals. The temple slowly rose above the city like a symbol of divine honor. And inside the temple, the beauty was breathtaking. The walls were covered in gold. Carvings of flowers, trees, and angels decorated the surfaces. Golden lamps illuminated the interior with warm light. Everything about the temple reflected reverence and glory. This was not just a building. It was meant to be a place where heaven and earth met. A place where the people of Israel could worship the God who had guided them for generations. After years of work, the temple was finally completed. The day of dedication became one of the most unforgettable moments in Israel's history. Thousands of people gathered in Jerusalem. Leaders from every tribe came to witness the ceremony. Priests carried the sacred Ark of the Covenant into the temple, placing it in the most holy place of the building. Then Solomon stood before the entire nation and offered a prayer. His words were humble and filled with awe. He acknowledged that no building could truly contain God. Yet he asked that the temple would always be a place where people could seek God's presence. As the ceremony continued, something extraordinary happened. According to the scriptures, a cloud filled the temple, a sign of God's presence. The priests were unable to continue their work because the glory of God filled the building so completely. The people watching the ceremony fell to their knees. They knew something sacred had just occurred. In that moment, the temple became the spiritual center of Israel. And Solomon's reputation grew even greater. But the temple was only one part of the transformation taking place in the kingdom. Jerusalem itself was becoming one of the most impressive cities in the region. Solomon built a magnificent royal palace, government buildings, and defensive structures. Roads connected the city to trade routes stretching across the ancient world. Merchants arrived from distant lands carrying goods that had rarely been seen in Israel before. Gold from Africa, spices from Arabia, precious stones from faraway mountains. Caravans moved constantly through the markets of Jerusalem, filling the city with wealth and opportunity. The kingdom became famous for its prosperity. Scripture describes a time when silver became so common in Jerusalem that it was considered almost worthless compared to the abundance of gold. Ships sailed to distant ports bringing rare materials and exotic treasures. Solomon's influence expanded far beyond the borders of Israel. Leaders from other nations sought alliances with him. Diplomatic relationships strengthened the kingdom's position in the region. For many people, Solomon's reign seemed like the fulfillment of a golden dream. Peace, wealth, wisdom, and a magnificent temple dedicated to God. Everything appeared perfect. Yet beneath the surface of this prosperity, something subtle was beginning to change. Because while Solomon was building a great kingdom, he was also building something else. Political alliances. In the ancient world, one of the most common ways to secure peace between nations was through marriage. A king would marry the daughter of another ruler, creating a family connection that strengthened diplomatic relationships. Solomon began forming these alliances. At first, they seemed like wise political decisions. Each marriage represented a new partnership, a new opportunity for peace and trade. But as time passed, the number of these alliances grew, and with them came something Solomon may not have fully considered: influence. Each foreign princess brought with her traditions, beliefs, and religious practices from her homeland. At first, these influences seemed distant from the heart of Israel's worship. But slowly, they began to find their way into the kingdom. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, believed he could manage these influences without allowing them to affect his devotion to God. After all, he had wisdom. He had understanding. He believed he could maintain control. But history has shown that even the wisest people can underestimate the power of gradual compromise. The Golden Kingdom of Israel continued to grow in wealth and glory. Visitors looked at Jerusalem and saw a city filled with success. But success can sometimes hide the earliest signs of danger. Because the choices Solomon was beginning to make would eventually lead him to a place he never intended to go. A place where wisdom would no longer guide his decisions. And the same king who built the greatest temple for God would one day allow something unimaginable to happen within his kingdom. The seeds of Solomon's fall had already been planted. They were small, quiet, almost invisible, but those seeds would grow, and in time, they would change the future of Israel forever. At the height of his power, the kingdom of Solomon seemed unstoppable. Jerusalem had become a center of wealth, culture, and influence. Traders from distant lands filled the markets. Diplomats arrived carrying gifts and seeking alliances. The temple stood at the heart of the city as a symbol of God's presence among his people. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But the greatest dangers rarely appear suddenly. They begin quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. And in Solomon's life, the danger did not begin with a dramatic rebellion or a sudden rejection of God. It began with compromise. In the ancient world, political alliances were often strengthened through marriage. Kings would marry the daughters of foreign rulers to build peaceful relationships between nations. At first, Solomon's marriages followed this pattern. A union with one kingdom meant stronger trade connections. Another marriage meant a new alliance and greater stability along Israel's borders. These decisions likely appeared wise from a political perspective. But over time, something remarkable happened. The number of these alliances grew, and grew, and grew. Scripture records that Solomon eventually had hundreds of wives and royal concubines, many of them princesses from foreign nations. 700 wives, 300 concubines. The number itself is staggering. Each marriage connected Solomon to another culture, another kingdom, another tradition. And with each new alliance came something else: religion. Many of these women came from nations that worshipped gods very different from the God of Israel. They had grown up honoring deities tied to their homeland, gods of war, fertility, nature, and power. When they arrived in Jerusalem, they brought those beliefs with them. At first, these practices may have remained private. Perhaps they worshipped quietly within their own homes. Perhaps Solomon believed it was harmless to allow them this freedom. After all, he was the king. He was wise. Surely he could allow these small compromises without affecting his own faith. But compromise rarely remains small. Little by little, Solomon's tolerance began to turn into acceptance. And acceptance slowly turned into participation. The same king who had once dedicated the great temple in Jerusalem to the worship of God now allowed something unthinkable to happen within his kingdom. Places of worship for foreign gods began to appear. Shrines were built on hills surrounding Jerusalem. Altars were raised for deities worshipped by Solomon's wives. One of those gods was called Molech, a terrifying figure worshipped by some neighboring nations. Another was Chemosh, honored by people from the land of Moab. And there were others, gods with names unfamiliar to Israel's traditions. Gods whose worship involved rituals far removed from the teachings of the God Solomon once served so faithfully. At first, these shrines may have seemed distant from the center of Israel's spiritual life. After all, the temple still stood in Jerusalem. The priests still offered sacrifices. The The people still gathered to worship the God of their ancestors. But the presence of these new altars revealed something deeper. Solomon's heart had begun to change. The man who once prayed for wisdom to lead God's people was now allowing influences that slowly pulled him away from that very purpose. Scripture describes this shift with painful clarity. As Solomon grew older, the foreign wives he had married began to influence his heart. They encouraged him to honor their gods, to build places of worship for them, to allow their traditions to flourish within the kingdom. And Solomon, the wisest king who had ever lived, allowed it. Perhaps he believed he could maintain balance. Perhaps he believed that allowing these practices would strengthen his alliances and keep peace among his many households. Or perhaps the gradual nature of compromise made it difficult for him to see how far he had drifted. But the result was undeniable. The king who had once built a temple to honor God was now supporting the worship of other gods. The shift was not immediate. It did not happen in a single day. Instead, it unfolded slowly across the years of Solomon's reign. Small decisions, small compromises, choices that may have seemed insignificant at the moment they were made. But when added together, those choices changed the direction of his life. For many people in Israel, the changes were confusing. Some may have wondered how the same king, who prayed such a powerful prayer at the dedication of the temple, could now support these foreign practices. Others may have believed that Solomon's wisdom justified his decisions. After all, he had ruled successfully for many years. He had brought prosperity and peace to the nation. Perhaps they trusted that the king understood things they did not. But the problem was not political. It was spiritual, and the scriptures make something very clear. God had warned the kings of Israel not to multiply wives from foreign nations. The reason was simple. Those relationships would eventually lead their hearts away from God. Solomon knew this warning. He understood the law given to the people of Israel, and yet he chose to ignore it. The consequences of that choice were beginning to take shape. Even though Israel still appeared strong on the outside, the foundation of the kingdom had begun to weaken. Because a leader's heart influences the entire nation. When a king remains faithful, the people often follow that example. But when a king begins to drift away from God, the entire nation can feel the effects. Solomon's story reveals a powerful truth about human nature. Wisdom does not automatically protect someone from making poor choices. Knowledge does not guarantee obedience. Even a person who understands what is right can still choose the wrong path. And sometimes the most dangerous mistakes come from believing that we are wise enough to handle compromise. Solomon had believed he could manage the influences around him. He believed he could allow certain practices without allowing them to control his heart. But compromise has a quiet power. It does not demand everything at once. It asks for small steps, small allowances, small changes that seem harmless. Until one day, a person realizes they have traveled far from where they began. That was the moment Solomon had reached. The golden king who once asked God for wisdom was now standing in a kingdom filled with temples to foreign gods. The warning signs were clear, and according to Scripture, God saw what was happening. The God who had blessed Solomon with wisdom, wealth, and honor was now deeply displeased with the direction of his life. Because Solomon had not simply made a political mistake, he had turned his heart away from the one who gave him everything. And the consequences of that decision would soon begin to unfold. The kingdom that appeared so powerful, the empire that seemed so stable, would soon face a future filled with division and conflict. Because even the wisest king in history could not escape the consequences of turning away from God. And the fall of Solomon was now closer than anyone in the kingdom realized. For many years, the kingdom of Solomon appeared as strong as ever. Jerusalem was still filled with wealth. Merchants continued arriving from distant lands, bringing goods and treasures from across the ancient world. The temple still stood in the center of the city, shining with gold and beauty. From the outside, the kingdom looked prosperous. But something deeper had begun to change. The scriptures tell us that God was angry with Solomon, not because Solomon had made a single mistake, but because the king who had once loved God with humility had allowed his heart to drift away. Years earlier, God had appeared to Solomon and given him wisdom beyond measure. That blessing had come with a condition, that Solomon would remain faithful and walk in the ways of God. But now Solomon had broken that trust. He had allowed the worship of foreign gods within the kingdom. He had built altars for them. He had permitted practices that the people of Israel had been warned against for generations. And so God spoke to Solomon again. This time, the message was not a promise of blessing. It was a warning of judgment. God declared that because Solomon had turned away, the kingdom would one day be torn apart. Israel would not remain united forever. After Solomon's reign ended, the nation would be divided. But even in judgment, there was mercy. God said the division would not happen during Solomon's lifetime, out of respect for his father, David. Instead, the consequences would come after Solomon's death. Still, the warning was clear. The golden age of Israel would not last forever. Soon after this declaration, new problems began to appear within the kingdom. Enemies who had once feared Israel started rising again. One of them was a man named Hadad. Hadad had once been a prince of Edom, a nation that David had defeated many years earlier. When David conquered the region, Hadad escaped as a child and fled to Egypt. There he grew up, waiting for the moment when Israel might become vulnerable again. Now that moment had come. As Solomon's influence began to weaken, Hadad returned to challenge Israel's authority in the south. Another enemy rose in the north, a man named Rezin. Rezin had once served under a defeated king, but eventually gathered followers and formed his own power base in the region of Damascus. Over time, he became a persistent enemy of Israel, disrupting trade routes and threatening stability along the borders. These rising enemies were not coincidences. They were signs that the protective peace surrounding Solomon's kingdom was beginning to fade. But the greatest challenge to Solomon's legacy would not come from outside the kingdom. It would come from within. Among Solomon's own officials was a talented and ambitious young leader named Jeroboam. Jeroboam had proven himself capable and hardworking. Because of his abilities, Solomon had placed him in charge of important labor projects within the kingdom. But Jeroboam's story was about to take a dramatic turn. One day, while traveling outside Jerusalem, Jeroboam encountered a prophet named Ahijah. The prophet approached him in the countryside and delivered a message that would change the future of Israel. Ahijah removed his cloak and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he gave 10 of those pieces to Jeroboam. The act was symbolic. It represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And the message was shocking. According to the prophet, God had decided that the kingdom would be divided. 10 tribes would eventually be taken away from the house of Solomon. Those tribes would be given to Jeroboam. Only a small portion of the kingdom would remain under Solomon's descendants. The prophecy confirmed what God had already declared to Solomon. The united kingdom of Israel would not survive. Jeroboam, hearing this message, realized that his future might hold power far greater than he had ever imagined. But Solomon eventually learned about the prophecy, and when he did, he saw Jeroboam not as a loyal official, but as a threat. The king who had once ruled with calm wisdom now reacted with fear and suspicion. Instead of seeking guidance or humility, Solomon attempted to remove the danger. Jeroboam was forced to flee the kingdom, escaping to Egypt where he would remain until Solomon's death. The tension surrounding the throne had returned. The peaceful kingdom that once seemed secure was now showing signs of instability. And perhaps the most tragic part of Solomon's story is this. Even as these problems unfolded, there is no clear record that the king ever fully returned to the humble faith he once showed at the beginning of his reign. The man who had written thousands of proverbs about wisdom now seemed trapped in the consequences of his own choices. The wealth of the kingdom continued. The palace remained magnificent. The temple still stood in Jerusalem. But the spiritual foundation that had once supported Solomon's greatness had weakened. History often remembers leaders for their greatest achievements. But sometimes the most important part of a story is not how high someone rises. It is how they finish. And Solomon's final years were filled with the quiet unfolding of consequences. The kingdom he built would soon face division. The unity David had fought so hard to establish would begin to fracture. The golden age of Israel was coming to an end. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, had built a kingdom of incredible beauty and power. But wisdom alone had not been enough to protect him from compromise. And the choices he made would shape the future of Israel long after his reign had ended. Soon, the throne he occupied would pass to the next generation. And when that happened, the cracks in the kingdom would finally break open. The empire Solomon created would never be the same again. The reign of Solomon had once defined the greatest era in the history of Israel. For decades, The kingdom had enjoyed peace unlike anything the nation had known before. Trade flourished. Gold flowed into Jerusalem. Nations from across the world recognized Israel as a center of wisdom and influence. But time moves forward for every king. And even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the quiet passage of years. As Solomon grew older, the glory of his earlier reign began to fade into memory. The grand buildings he had constructed still stood tall: the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the royal palace, the fortified cities scattered across the kingdom. Travelers continued to admire the wealth and beauty of the nation. Yet beneath that impressive surface, the spiritual strength that once guided Israel had weakened. The king who had once prayed with humility before God had slowly allowed compromise to shape his later years. And now, the consequences of those choices were approaching. Scripture tells us that Solomon ruled Israel for 40 years. 40 years filled with wisdom, achievements, wealth, and influence. But also years marked by decisions that would eventually change the future of the entire nation. When Solomon's life finally came to an end, he was laid to rest in the city of David, the same city where his father, David, had once ruled with passionate devotion to God. It was a moment filled with both honor and quiet sadness. Because Solomon's legacy was complicated. On one hand, he had accomplished things few leaders in history could ever dream of achieving. He had built the first temple dedicated to God in Jerusalem. He had transformed Israel into a center of learning and culture. He had become famous across the ancient world for his wisdom. Yet on the other hand, the final chapters of his story carried a warning that could not be ignored. The king who possessed unmatched wisdom had allowed his heart to drift. And the effects of that drift would soon shape the destiny of Israel. After Solomon's death, his son took the throne. His name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam inherited one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in the region. But he also inherited a nation filled with growing tension. During Solomon's reign, many large construction projects had been completed. While these projects created magnificent structures, they also required heavy labor from the people of Israel. Workers had spent years building palaces, fortifications, and cities. Taxes and labor demands had increased. As long as Solomon ruled, his authority and reputation helped maintain unity. But once he was gone, the people began asking an important question. Would the new king continue these heavy burdens? When Rehoboam traveled to the city of Shechem to be officially crowned king, representatives from the tribes of Israel approached him with a request. They spoke respectfully but honestly. They told the new king that the labor and taxation during Solomon's reign had been difficult, and they asked for relief. If Rehoboam would lighten the burden placed on the people, they promised they would serve him faithfully. It was a critical moment. Rehoboam had an opportunity to unite the nation and strengthen his rule. First, he consulted the older advisors who had served under Solomon. These men had witnessed the rise and fall of great leaders. They understood the fragile nature of power. Their advice was simple. If Rehoboam showed kindness and listened to the people, they would remain loyal to him for life. But the young king did not stop there. He also sought advice from the younger men who had grown up alongside him in the royal court. Their perspective was very different. Instead of encouraging humility, they urged Rehoboam to display strength. They told him that reducing the burdens of the people would make him appear weak. Instead, they suggested he should rule with even greater authority than his father. When the people returned to hear the king's decision, they were hopeful. But the answer they received shocked them. Rehoboam rejected the wise counsel of the older advisors. Instead, he followed the advice of his younger companions. He told the people that their burdens would not become lighter. In fact, they would become heavier. His words were harsh. Instead of bringing unity, they created anger and frustration across the tribes of Israel. In that moment, the fragile unity of the kingdom finally broke. The northern tribes of Israel refused to accept Rehoboam as their ruler. They declared their independence from the house of David, and they chose a new king. That king was none other than Jeroboam, the same man who had once served under Solomon and later fled to Egypt. The prophecy spoken years earlier had now come true. The united kingdom established by David and expanded by Solomon was divided. Two separate nations emerged from what had once been a single kingdom. The northern tribes formed the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. The southern tribes remained loyal to the family of David and became known as the Kingdom of Judah under Rehoboam. The consequences of Solomon's choices had fully unfolded. What had once been a powerful united kingdom was now fractured into two separate nations. From that point forward, Israel's history would be marked by conflict, instability, and spiritual struggles. And yet, despite everything that went wrong in Solomon's later years, his story still holds incredible value. Because Solomon's life reveals one of the most important truths about leadership, wisdom, and faith. A great beginning does not guarantee a great ending. A person may receive incredible gifts, opportunities, and blessings. But those blessings must be protected by humility and faithfulness. Solomon had started his journey with a humble prayer for wisdom. He had governed with brilliance. He had built a kingdom that inspired the world. Yet even the wisest man in history discovered something that every generation must remember. Wisdom alone is not enough. True strength comes from a heart that remains faithful. And when that faith begins to fade, even the greatest kingdoms can begin to fall. Solomon's life was filled with glory, wisdom, and achievement. But it also became a powerful reminder that the direction of the human heart matters more than any treasure, palace, or throne. The Golden King had built one of the greatest empires in Israel's history. But the legacy he left behind would forever remind future generations of a simple but powerful truth. Even the wisest person must guard their heart. Because when wisdom loses its way, even kings can fall. History remembers kings in many different ways. Some are remembered for their victories in battle, some for the kingdoms they built, some for the wealth they gathered. But the story of Solomon is remembered for something far more complex. He is remembered as the wisest king who ever lived, and also as a man who slowly lost his way. Few rulers in history began their journey with such promise. When Solomon first took the throne, he was young and uncertain. Standing before God, he did not ask for wealth. He did not ask for power. He did not ask for long life. Instead, he asked for wisdom. That humble request changed everything. God granted Solomon a mind unlike any other ruler in history. His wisdom became legendary. People traveled from distant lands just to hear him speak. Under his leadership, Israel experienced an era of peace and prosperity that had never existed before. The temple in Jerusalem stood as a symbol of faith and devotion. The kingdom flourished, and Solomon became famous throughout the world. For a time, it seemed as though everything he touched turned to success. But Solomon's story reveals something deeply human. Even the most gifted person can slowly drift away from what truly matters. The tragedy of Solomon's life was not that he lacked wisdom. It was that wisdom alone could not protect his heart. Over the years, the same king who once prayed with humility began making compromises. Small decisions, small allowances, choices that seemed harmless at first. But over time, those choices led him further from the faith that had once defined his life. Foreign alliances became foreign influences. Political marriages became spiritual compromises. And eventually, the king who had built a temple for God allowed other altars to rise within his kingdom. The shift did not happen overnight. It happened gradually. That is often how the most important changes in life occur. Not through one dramatic moment, but through many small steps taken in the wrong direction. Solomon's later years became a warning for future generations. Because even though he had everything a ruler could desire, wealth, knowledge, influence, and power, he still discovered a difficult truth. Success cannot replace faithfulness. A person can achieve greatness and still lose their way. And sometimes the greatest danger is believing that wisdom alone is enough to guide us. The consequences of Solomon's choices did not fully appear until after his death. When his son, Rehoboam, inherited the throne, the kingdom began to fracture. The unity built by David and expanded by Solomon collapsed. Israel divided into two nations. The Golden Age had ended. What had once been a single powerful kingdom became two rival states struggling to survive. And yet, despite the mistakes and failures that marked Solomon's later years, his story still offers something incredibly valuable: perspective. Because Solomon himself eventually reflected deeply on the meaning of life. Tradition connects many of these reflections to the writings found in the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. In those writings, the voice of a king speaks honestly about his experiences. He describes wealth. He describes pleasure. He describes achievements, knowledge, and success. And after exploring all of it, he arrives at a surprising conclusion. None of those things alone can truly satisfy the human soul. They are temporary. They fade. They pass away like the wind. For a man who once possessed unimaginable riches and wisdom, this realization carried powerful weight. Solomon had seen the highest peaks of success. He had lived a life filled with opportunity. And yet his final reflections suggest that something deeper matters more than power or knowledge. A faithful heart. That lesson is why Solomon's story continues to be told thousands of years later. Because his life mirrors the journey that many people experience. We chase success. We pursue knowledge. We build careers, relationships, and achievements. And those things can bring meaning and purpose. But Solomon's life reminds us that the direction of our hearts ultimately matters most. Without that foundation, even the greatest accomplishments can begin to feel empty. It is remarkable to consider that the wisest king in history left behind a story that is both inspiring and cautionary. His wisdom changed nations. His buildings shaped history. His influence spread across the ancient world. But his life also revealed that wisdom must be paired with humility and faithfulness. Otherwise, even the brightest mind can slowly lose its direction. The story of Solomon does not end simply with the fall of a kingdom. It ends with a lesson, a reminder that every generation must choose the path it will follow. Power will always be tempting. Success will always be attractive. But lasting strength comes from something deeper, from guarding the heart, from remaining faithful even when success makes compromise easier. Solomon's life began with a prayer for wisdom. And although his journey became complicated, that prayer still echoes through history. Because wisdom itself is not the final destination. True wisdom is knowing what matters most and choosing to remain faithful to it. Even kings must learn that lesson. And the story of Solomon ensures that the world will never forget it.